to a new episode of Books and Beyond from the Winter Park Library, recorded live in the recording studio at the library in beautiful Winter Park, Florida. In Books and Beyond, we have conversations with writers, musicians, artists, presenters, and other contributors. Most of our guests have appeared live at the Winter Park Library or will be presenting soon. We hope you'll subscribe to the Books and Beyond podcast and that you'll stay up to date with library goings-on at winterparklibrary.org/events. That's winterparklibrary.org/events. I'm Michael Werner, and I'll be your host for our interviews. Enjoy the show. Hello out there, library patrons, readers, and smart people everywhere. We're here today with a guest that we've had on the show before, and we've asked him back, and he's kindly agreed to come back. This is Greg Dawson with us today. Today we wanted to sort of separate Greg into two episodes. The prior episode, if you go back and look in the podcast, prior episode, we had Greg here to talk about his career as a writer. But we wanted to isolate one of his particular books to talk about that today. It's a book called Hiding in the Spotlight, and it's a heart-wrenching and just a phenomenally incredible story. And I thought we'd have Greg to talk to us today just about that book. And Greg, welcome back. Welcome back. Good to see you again.
Hey, it's great to be back, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. Greg, if you don't mind, I thought maybe a really good way to introduce this book is just sort of if you could read a couple of paragraphs at the beginning of the book in the preface.
Yes, this is the prelude.
Or the prelude. I'm sorry.
Prelude to the to the book, and the book is Hiding in the Spotlight, and this is the prelude. So that's it. Kremenchug, Ukraine, 1942. My name is Anna Morozova. I am from Kharkov. My sister Marina and I are orphans. Our father was an officer in the Red Army and was killed in action. Our mother died in the bombing of Kharkov. She had repeated it so many times it had become a nightmare echo in her head that would not stop. My name is Anna Morozova. This was all that was left of her life now, these 5 sentences. The war and the Nazis had taken everything else. Everything except the sheet music she tucked inside her shirt in the final moments before fleeing her home at gunpoint. For 6 months, she and her sister had been running, hiding, and surviving. To everyone they met, countrymen who gave them shelter in their homes, farmers who offered rides in the backs of their wagons, Nazi soldiers who stopped them on the road, the director of an orphanage, she told the same story. My name is Anna Morozova. I am from Kharkov. My sister Marina and I are orphans. Our father was an officer in the Red Army and was killed in action. Our mother died in the bombing of Kharkov. She had repeated it so often, with such urgency and conviction, there were times she almost believed it was true. My name is Anna Morozova. It was true that she and her sister were orphans from Kharkov. The rest was a lie. Their names were not Anna and Marina Morozova. Their father was not an officer in the Red Army. Their mother did not die in the bombing of Kharkov. Their real names were Zhana and Frina Arshanskaya. Their father was a candy maker. They were Jews.
Wow, that's chilling, Greg. I mean, it still must make you shudder a little bit. Reading those
actually,
words.
I hadn't read that, especially out loud, for quite some time. The book came out 15 years ago.
Okay.
And it was startling, and it was certainly startling the first time I heard the story from my mother, and that was when I was 30 years old. And it was startling. So many scores. All I knew at that point in my life was that growing up, she had been she was from Russia. I knew that, could tell that growing up. I was like bilingual until I was 5 years old, and she was.
Do you still speak Russian?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I was bilingual growing up in Indiana, southern Indiana, where she and my father were on the music faculty at Indiana University, and I was obviously the only kid in the neighborhood who had a Russian mother who played piano several hours a day. And so I was bilingual until I was 5 years old. And then it became self-conscious. And I asked her, please stop talking Russian to me in front of my friends. And she foolishly agreed. And so I lost all my I lost all my bilingual ability, which I really, really regret now. But yes, it was quite startling to hear the story from her. I didn't really know that much about the Holocaust growing up. When I was growing up in the late 50s and early 60s in Bloomington, that was way before any real Holocaust awareness in this country.
Right.
The first time the New York Times even used the word Holocaust in the paper was like 1959. And so I'd grown up largely, we're not observant Jews. My dad was a Catholic, born in Virginia. So yes, it was startling to me to learn this about her when I was 30 years old.
So growing up, you had no idea of your mom's background, none.
Except that she was
Russian. She spoke Russian.
She came to this country after the war, spoke Russian. But I didn't have any idea that she was caught up in anything like the Holocaust, which itself was kind of a very distant thing to me. I mean, we all kind of knew who Hitler was. This crazy guy pumping his fist, this terrible man in Germany. And we understood that there were Jews, who were murdered, but no sense of what the Holocaust itself really was, or that there were things like survivors or anything like that. It was just another piece of history, which, when you're young, history is not very interesting to you.
Yeah.
You're looking to the future. You're really not very interested in what happened before, right?
Right.
It'd be a terrible, hardest job, I think, in school would be teach young kids history, But so, no, I didn't have a clue about that. And then so that's how I first learned about it. Became the prelude to the to the book, or the essential story. That was the essential story and beyond that, from which flowed all sorts of incredible circumstances and events that over the course of the almost 6 years that she and her sister were on the run after their parents were murdered.
Can you give us a little overview of that time period of their lives? I mean, that just just tell us about that. I mean, what was that like for her, and how did she get out of the? Well, how did she escape?
I would say first of all, the headline on that is music saved her life and her sister's life. She and her sister, who were 2 years younger, were piano prodigies. They grew up in eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv, which is the part that we've become acquainted with in all the coverage of the terrible war now, Putin's war. And Kharkiv is one of the cities that, along with Kiev, that's been pounded the worst and by in that war. But anyway, they grew up largely there as piano prodigies, and when the German army invaded Ukraine in 1941, they were going west-east. Their destination, their goal was to get to Stalingrad and to conquer Stalingrad, which they never did, of course. But as they rolled through Ukraine, they were followed by what were mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen, which were these special squads of soldiers, German soldiers, whose only job, following in the wake of the Wehrmacht, the German army, which would go in and take the towns and occupy the towns, was to collect all the Jews they could find, take them out to the edge of town, and shoot them and bury them in open pits, and this became known as the Holocaust by bullets. And they did this in 1941-42. It's estimated that upwards of at least 1 million Ukrainian Jews died in that manner between the middle of 1941 middle of 1942. And that is actually the dawn of the Holocaust as we know it. If we define the Holocaust as a mass extermination of the Jews, that's where it began, not in places like Auschwitz or Treblinka or the other terrible death camps.
Those were all later, right?
Those weren't even in operation until the spring of 1942, by which time probably 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews had already been slaughtered. So when the German army reached Kharkiv in the October of 1941, they occupied the town as they did. They collected all the Jews, 16,000 Jews. They took them out to the edge of town, told them they were going to a work camp, and marched them off to a killing field outside Kharkiv, where about 16,000 of them were murdered in that manner I described and buried in open pits. No gas, just bullets. And on the way to that, it was a 2 or 3 day trek to the killing field in horrendously cold winter weather. Many people perished before they even got to the killing field. But on the way there, my mother and her sister separately managed to miraculously escape the death march.
And how old were they?
14 and 12.
Okay.
And at different points, my mother, I know exactly how my mother did it because she told me. And she had basically run out of line at one point. Her father bribed one of the guards who were patrolling the sad procession of Jews, had bribed a guard with a gold watch to turn his head. And when he turned his head, my mother ran out of line off into the woods off the road and hid until the procession was out of sight. And she never knew how her sister escaped, and her sister Frina never divulged that. When I was writing the book, I asked Frina to speak with me, and she declined twice to be interviewed. And so there are theories about how she escaped, but they both did. And after they escaped, they were reunited in Kharkiv, and where they were hidden for a while by a Christian family, a couple of weeks while the Germans were still occupying the city, which was an act of incredible courage by that family, because the rule was any family who was caught harboring Jews would be murdered along with the Jews. So for 2 or 3 weeks they were hidden there, and then after that they had to leave, and the family helped them devise new identities and a new story for their life, and they changed their names from Zhana and Frina Arshanskaya to Anna and Marina Morozova. My mother was Anna.
So Christian names.
Christian names,
Yeah.
and Christian names, and they changed their story to the one that was in the prelude about their father being killed and their mother being died in the bombing, and they were orphans. And from that point on, for the next 5 years, they made it from one place to another, concealing their true identities as Jews, and ending up ultimately performing for the Nazis, who didn't know that they were Jewish. And they traveled. They were in occupied cities for a while, performing for Nazi regular Nazi soldiers, German soldiers, who loved classical music, and they needed to be entertained because they had nothing to do when they were occupying cities, and they did that. They also were summoned to perform in the private quarters of field generals and Gestapo, and they would come and they would have dinner with them, and then after dinner they would be asked to perform Chopin and Brahms and Beethoven.
I can't imagine anybody doing that, let alone a young girl. I mean,
incredible.
A teenager. Yeah.
And then when the Germans were retreating, when they were losing, they were retreating in 44 and 45, they took the girls with them to Berlin. And so they...
As musicians.
As musicians. They took them with them to Berlin, and as musicians, where they did the same sort of concerts. They were also sent out to slave labor camps to perform. And this was, in one case, very dicey, because at one slave labor camp in Germany, one of the slave workers happened to be somebody from their town that they knew.
Oh. And
that person cried out to them, "Zhana, Frina, we know you." And they say, "No, don't," because they thought they were going to be busted. The Germans would learn their identities. They said, "No, we don't know that woman, and that girl," and so they spent about a year in Berlin, performing for the Germans, and being sent also to places like Czechoslovakia to perform. And they would get up. They were free to walk around Berlin, past the Nazi headquarters and the bunker where Hitler had his headquarters, and the Germans knew that they weren't going to escape because they had nowhere to go. They were in Berlin, and so that's where they were until the end of the war. They got out of Berlin just as the Red Army was approaching, because the word was you didn't want to be in Berlin when the Red Army got there. The Red Army was exceptionally brutal, very much like what we're hearing about what's happening in Ukraine today. So anyway, at the end of the war, they escaped to southern Germany, where they went to a displaced persons camp, and they spent close to a year there, waiting to be repatriated to the Soviet Union. My mother always wanted to go home. Her sister refused.
Back to Ukraine.
To go back to Ukraine, and so my mother wouldn't go without Frina, and so that turned out to be a very good thing, because many Russians who had left the Soviet Union,
and they were still posing as Russians
at that point. At that point, many Russians.
Their story.
Well, at that point, they still had not. They had still maintained their false identity. To a lesser degree than before, but the Soviets. This included soldiers, by the way. But whether they were Soviet soldiers, or whether they were people like my mother who had been forced by the Germans to leave the country, those who went back to the Soviet Union were considered traitors by Stalin, and many of them were murdered. Now, it doesn't make any sense that Stalin would consider soldiers who were on the front fighting, or that people like my mother and her sister who were forced out of Germany. But many of them were murdered or sent to gulags in Siberia. And so Frina's refusing to go back probably saved my mother's life, because she wanted to go back. And so they didn't, and that led to and then ultimately they were discovered. Their musical ability was discovered by the head of the camp, who was an American Army lieutenant whose name was Larry Dawson. He was a music lover from Virginia, and he became infatuated with them. And he said, I'm going to get you to America, and you're going to go to the Juilliard. And they had no idea what the Juilliard was. Right. And so, but they loved Larry because he was so enthusiastic and so American, and he. It was funny when they first, after the end of the war in May of 1945, and my mother and Frina, they were in Germany, and the war was over, and their first goal was to find the Americans, and they had never met an American before, and so they were walking, trying to find some place, and they finally found a place that said, "Oh yeah, the Americans are over in this in the building over here." And they went in, and the first thing they saw was an American officer with his feet up on the desk, and they thought, "Oh my God, he has his feet up on the desk." That never happened in the Russian. So it was very formal, and they thought, "This is what Americans were." They put their feet up on the desk, you know. Yeah. And so they met. Ultimately, Larry Dawson, the head of the camp where they were near Munich. They were there for a long time, and they were quite bored. And one day they found an old piano in some building at this displaced persons camp. And they sat down, and they were playing the piano just to entertain themselves, and they decided to put on a show with some other people who had been entertainers in the camp. And Larry wandered into one of these shows, and he heard it, and he became infatuated with them. So that's what he became determined to bring them to this country. And so he did. They were on the first ship of Holocaust survivors to come to this country after the war, which is May 1946, and they came to this country, and he got them. Ultimately, he got them into the Juilliard. They both were immediately given scholarships to Juilliard, also to the Peabody Institute, but that wasn't good enough for Larry. He wanted them to get into Juilliard, so they got in, and that's where they got their more formal training. And then from then on, my mother eventually met Larry's brother, who's David Dawson.
So Larry's not your dad. Larry.
Ultimately, she met Larry's brother, David, younger brother, David Dawson. He was a viola player. He had also gone to Juilliard. He was also a child prodigy, but many years, a decade earlier. But they met because of Larry. And then ultimately, they were married. David and my mom were married, and we ended up in Indiana when he was. My dad was offered a job with the string quartet, the first string quartet at IU. And I understand that one of the one of the only string quartets at any state university in the country at the time. That's because of the vision of Herman Wells, the great president of Indiana University, and we talk about him forever. But Herman gave permission to the dean to build a world-class school of music in southern Indiana, of all places, and he did. And now Indiana School of Music is commonly put in the same echelon with Juilliard, Curtis, Peabody, and those.
Greg, excuse me just for a second. I've always heard that people couldn't get into IU, go to Juilliard. That's what I've heard.
That people
that can't get into IU, go to Juilliard. That's what I've heard.
I like that. I hope I don't know if it's true, but they definitely are on a par. But anyway, that was my that's their basic story, and my mother's basic story, and the journey. That 5 years journey included lots of things I didn't go into, but I went back. I've been to Ukraine a couple of times and discovered a lot about her story. I went back to the house where she lived and things like that.
Wow. Okay. So it's still there.
And yes, the house is there. And I wanted to knock on the door. I wanted to know if the piano was still there. But I just couldn't bring myself to do it because it would have been too jarring for whoever was living there.
Did she go back with you, or has she ever been back?
Nope. We asked. After she came to this country in 1946, she never left after that. We invited her. When my wife Candy and I went to Ukraine to do research, we asked her if she wanted to come. She said, no, thank you very much. And instead, what she did is something invaluable, which was so prescient on her part, is I didn't speak. I knew 30, 35 words of disconnected Russian, right? Not conversational. But she wrote a handwritten note in Russian addressed it to dear countrymen. And she said who we were and why we were there. And she hoped that her countrymen, would treat us well and help us discover her story. And it was a lovely card. And that was very important because when we got there to Ukraine, and this is 2006, we got there and we noticed immediately that everybody was very standoffish. And we're not traveling light. We had a bunch of suitcases and stuff. I don't know what we were thinking. But anyway, we would get on a train. And you know how it is when you're getting off a train with a lot of luggage. Usually there's somebody on the platform, conductor or one of the, who say, oh, can we help you with your bags?
Right.
There, when we were getting off trains or even on, nobody was offering to help us at all. And nobody wanted to engage us in conversation. We thought, well, that's strange. We know the Ukrainian are friendly people. Ukrainians are friendly people. And so we were just really couldn't understand that because we weren't threatening in any way, I didn't think. And so when we finally got to one of the towns where we wanted to, actually her actual hometown, which is a place called Berdyansk, which was on the Sea of Azov in southern Ukraine, closer to a place called Mariupol, which is one of the places that was really horribly, just basically destroyed by Putin. But when we got there and started to want to talk to people, if we could, when we handed them a card, they would read it, and their faces would brighten up, and they could sense, they could see it was legitimate, and that my mother was speaking to them, and they completely changed their demeanor, and they welcomed us.
Yeah.
And I think the reason they're thinking about this is that we didn't think about the fact that they had been living in a police state for 70 years or whatever, or longer, and in which anybody could have been somebody from the KGB. They could have been somebody who's listening. Yeah. And so they were afraid to engage with us as Westerners because they didn't know who we were. They thought we might be CIA, might be KGB, or they might be seen talking to us. And so they were but once we gave them that card, they opened up completely. And they were just wonderful. But it was so smart of my mother to do it in that way. And she said something that I know you'll love them as much as they love you. And so, yeah.
Greg, this is just fascinating to me. I mean, and there's really two stories here, right? I mean, there's the story of your mom and her sister, But there's a story about you too. I mean, about your discovery of these stories.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And again, I didn't know anything about the story I've just described until I was 30 years old. And the reason that happened is 1978, exactly when it happened, is that NBC, I had a miniseries called Holocaust. It was in April of 1968, like 6 or 8 hours long, over several nights. And it was a big sort of not just a TV event, but it was only a cultural sort of societal event, because it was the first time this event, possibly the most important of the 20th century, had been treated in a serious way by American television. And so I was writing a column for the newspaper in Bloomington at the time. And like most columns, I was always struggling for an idea. I needed a subject. And I looked at this miniseries and I thought, well, there's got to be a column here in here for me somewhere. I didn't know where, but something. I can usually.
There's a story here. There's a pony under there.
There's got to be something. Usually, any columnist worth his salt can get a germ of an idea, and you can build it into a column. Okay, and so I thought, well, maybe. I knew my mother's Russian, had been involved in some way in the war. Had come over after the war. She was a refugee and all that. I thought, well, maybe she has a couple of anecdotes or stories she could give me that I could somehow spin into a column that would, about relating to this miniseries. And so at the time, my dad had died a few years before that, at 62, and she moved to Wisconsin to take a job up there. And so I called her and I said, Mom, I'm working on a column. It's about this miniseries about the Holocaust, and she.
Hoping she might have one or two little anecdotes, right?
Is there anything, tell me anything about your war experience? I mean, what it was like that maybe would relate to this. And so then, boy, did she. For the next, 45 minutes or an hour, she gave me the broad outlines of her incredible experience during the Holocaust. And I was stunned. This is the first time I was hearing it. And I was 30 years old, and it was astounding. People must say, "Well, you must have been. How did you feel? How did you react? Were you was it devastating for you in any way?" And I said, oddly no. And I said, mostly, I'm ashamed to say it, but my main reaction as a journalist was, damn, this is going to be great copy. This is going to be a great story. Thanks, Mom. But when they said, but it was your mother, and I said, yes, I know, but I was 30 years old. It's not like hearing it when you're a kid.
Right.
And by then I had kids myself. Your emotional armor has been established. You have some as an adult. And I actually was able to see it from a distance in that way, even though it was my mom. It was hard. I saw it in that way, and it was all. Furthermore, it was difficult to imagine my mother, who's a powerful pianist but really tight, kind of small person and slight. It's hard to imagine her going through that. I mean, it was just hard to envision it.
Well, especially since you really knew her as mom, as the mom in a Midwestern town, which, as you know, I grew up close to you.
Yep.
And you're living in this idea. You're living in the Leave It to Beaver world.
Exactly.
And your mom came out of the Holocaust. I mean,
exactly.
you can't connect those two things.
It's interesting you say that, because part of my introduction to the book, I actually mentioned it was very much a Leave It to Beaver childhood.
Yeah.
That we had at the time, because we grew up exactly the same era, and so it was hard to imagine. But anyways, that's when I learned about it, and it produced a terrific long story that ran during the miniseries. And for a long time after that, I mean, immediately, and then for a long time, my mentor at the paper and others, Candy, said, you should do a book. You should do a book on this, because, and I thought, nah, I don't think so. I'm not a book writer, really don't have time. And it went on like that for years and years. I was encouraged to do it. I always backed away from it because I didn't think I could do it. I wasn't equipped for it as a writer. I'm not a book writer. But anyway, fast forward 16 years from the miniseries, 16 years to when my daughter, Amy, was in middle school in Winter Park. And they received, this is a common assignment, I think, apparently, is that students are asked in a history class, she was asked to interview one of her grandparents about what their life was like at the same time, same age, like 13. Right? Well, as it happens, Amy only had one grandparent left at that point. The others had passed away, and so she said, Amy showed us the assignment. She said, "I'm going to write Grandma Z." She called her Z, Jana, for sure. Grandma Z, and ask her if she'll tell me what her life was like. And I knew how resistant my mother was to talking about this. After she did that interview with me in 1978, she let it be known that she was done. She didn't want to talk about it anymore. Yeah. And so that was another reason to do the book, because I knew not only was I uncertain about my ability to do the book, but I knew she really didn't want to talk about it anymore. And so anyway, this is 1994. And so Amy wrote the letter to my mother saying, "Dear Z, I have this assignment." And she said, "I just wonder if there were any major world events going on at the time that had an effect on your life."
And you hadn't told her any of the story. You hadn't told her Amy.
Not much, not much. A little bit, bare outlines. She was, and so we said, okay, and we thought, well, good luck with that.
Right.
She mailed it off, and amazingly, a couple weeks later, she received this amazing 5-page handwritten letter from my mother, divulging in extremely personal terms, more personal terms than she had ever told me, for the original story in the paper, about her experience and how it hit her at a really more personal level than she had ever described to me. And it's fleshed out the story in important ways, and we wondered, why did she do it? We realized at that point that there's a special relationship between grandparents and grandchildren. It's because Amy asked, and it wasn't just Amy. My mother realized the importance of Amy knowing, but also her classmates and her whole generation, and the ones that are coming afterwards. And suddenly a light went on for my mother, and she realized how important it was for her to actually talk about her experience. And at that point, she became more willing, even eager, for us to do the book. So that's how, if it weren't for that assignment that Amy got, that light never would have come on for her.
And thus probably no book.
And absolutely not. And so, and so that's what led to the writing of the book. And it was hard for me, very hard for me, because I was a columnist basically, and I asked my mentor, I said, I don't know if I can do this. I just do a long, sustained narrative, 300 pages. He said, well, look at it this way. Just think of it as a series of columns. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, I can do that, actually. I think I can do that. I can do that and have some connective tissue between the chapters to make it seem like a real book.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and so it was really it turned out I did my best on that and tried and made it. First of all, the story is so amazing. There's not much filler required. There's so much going on, and I say this cautiously because let me say that all Holocaust stories are important. There are many out there now, that there's not much going on. There's not a lot of history. There are a lot of books about people like myself going back and discovering where their parents had lived and stuff like that. But there's not much else going on. This and I say with no pride of authorship, this is an extraordinary story, even by Holocaust standards. And I say that because of the story I've described. It's constantly a movement in this story, literally physical movement and episodic movement. And when you think about it, most Holocaust stories are static. They're stuck. Someone is stuck in an attic, Anne Frank, a cave, a basement, a farm. They're captives.
Right.
And of course they are heroically surviving, and they're in great peril. But there's not a lot going on. In my mother's story, there was so much going on.
Yeah, she was living
one thing to another.
Sort of a normal life. In a weirdly way, normal life. Yeah.
And so it presented so much interesting material that it made it easier for a writer to move from one consequential event to the next. It's kind of panoramic in its nature, the story, and so that's how the book came to happen, and it was absolutely essential. I go back to Ukraine. I thought initially I could just get by on interviews with her. My first draft wasn't so good. Candy said, "You've got to go back to Ukraine. You know, we have to go to Ukraine for the first time," and I said, "Really? We have to do that? It's going to be a long time. It's going to be expensive and all that." But we went, and that made all the difference because I had to walk in her footsteps, literally walk in her footsteps. I had to go to the school where she, the academy where she learned, studied as a pianist, and go back to those places to get a sense of, truly try to get a sense of what her life was like, and so yeah, it was nothing I could have imagined doing, but it was certainly the project of my life. I'll put it that way.
Yeah,
this is the term paper I never did in college.
Right. And did you have? When did you get a publisher? Was it during the writing or after the writing, or when did that happen?
After the writing.
So you were going to write the book anyway, no matter what.
Yeah, I was going to write the book and hope for the best, and I wasn't going to nobody was going to give me an advance, an advance beforehand, and.
But you did have some credentials. I mean, you were a journalist.
Yeah, but it's so hard even then. I mean, first of all, the first thing you have to do is find an agent.
Yeah. Because
the reality is, if you want to get it published by a real publishing house, not self-publishing, I did one of my books self-publishing, but this one, you just don't. You have to have an agent do it. The publishing houses get so many manuscripts that they get to the point where they say, "I'm sorry, we will not look at unagented
right." So the
manuscript.
agents are their filters.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. It's the first filter. Well, even getting an agent is hard because let's face it,
they're getting the same manuscripts that the publishers are getting.
Well,
they are,
but they only have one interest. They only want to be an agent for a book that might make them some money. That's what they do. That's the way they make their money.
Right.
And so that's why it can be the greatest thing in the world, but they think, I can't sell this thing to anybody. I can't make any money. They're not going to be your agent. And I finally did find one in Texas who, ironically enough, specialized in Christian books.
Really interesting.
So here, but she took it and she found a publisher, this wonderful small independent publisher in New York, Pegasus Books. And the only reason they took it is because the serendipity is that their acquiring editor, the one who reads the manuscripts and decides what they're interested in, what they'll take, was a young woman who had majored in music and Russian history at Princeton.
Wow!
So bingo! This is like she got it, and she thought, yeah, this really does interest me. And so I was lucky, very, very fortunate to get Pegasus as the publisher. But this is long after. We had the manuscript done, and one of the most humbling things. One thing about an agent I didn't understand is that when you have a professional agent, you give them their manuscript, they're able to send it out, push a button on their typewriter, and send it out to 75 publishers.
Right.
Yet at the same time. And she showed me the printout once of the responses she had gotten from publishing houses, big and small, and boy, was that humbling experience.
Yeah.
There were a lot of things that a lot of them started out by saying, "No, thanks, this is not for us." But others would say, "Well, I really like the story, but I found the writing underwhelming," and so it's like, "Ouch," And then there were others who said, "Yes, it's really good. It's actually I found the writing was quite good, but it seemed we just don't think we can sell it for some reason, even though it was kind of a unique story." First of all, it's about the Ukraine. Very, very few books like this have been written specifically about Ukraine, which, as I was saying earlier, it's really where the Holocaust as we know it really largely began. And I was hoping that when later, many years later, a couple of years ago, when a new version of it came out for middle schoolers called Alias Anna, I did with a wonderful children's book author who collaborated on it. When it came out a couple of years ago, I thought, this will get the attention of movie makers, because it's about Ukraine, which suddenly was a big deal.
Right,
Everybody
right,
was
right.
focused on Ukraine. Nobody knew where it was until the war, basically. And I thought, wow, this will attract maybe movie makers, because I think as good as this story was for a book, I think its true destination is the screen. Now I'm thinking, I used to think movie, hasn't happened. Now I'm thinking Netflix, because it's episodic. It would be great, 6 to 8 episodes.
Right.
It could write itself, basically. That hasn't happened either. So I'm very frustrated.
Have you approached those
We've
kind
tried.
of people? Or your
Well,
agent has? You still have the same agent?
No, she's out of the agenting business
Okay.
now. Film is a whole different animal.
Sure.
Candy my wife wrote a screenplay that is
Based on this story?
based on this. She went out to L.A. She pitched it at one of those speed dating things with
speed pitching?
movie housing. Yeah,
I've never heard of
you
that.
have 5
Okay.
minutes at a time with different motion picture studios, and they got some good positive feedback on it, but nothing ever happened. And I think that
I can see a series there. Yeah, for
absolutely.
sure.
It's so visual. Again, going
Yeah.
back to my point about it's so panoramic in nature, which makes it very unusual. But we'll see if that ever happens. But
Well, Greg, the book is done well. I've just looked before we're talking today. I mean, it's in the 4th or 5th printing now. I mean, so it's been around. It's getting around.
Yes, it's done fine. It's done quite well. Yeah, and for a book that's not by an author with a name,
Right.
but no, I'm just hoping that someday the right person. The way it works, I understand. I'm told in Hollywood, the right person has to pick up the book, who's already there, a producer, an actor, a director, say, I want to do this. You rarely get in by pitching it,
Right.
First of all, there's several walls of agents between all the big movie houses and all the big directors and stuff. But even a bad director can make a good movie out of this story.
Oh, I would
so
think
I'm
so.
still
It's just-
waiting.
yeah,
That's my hope, and because I can see it. It also has a built-in musical score, right? So,
Right.
So we'll see.
Wow, wonderful story. Well, Greg, I want to. Gosh, we could talk about this for hours. I want to remind everybody the name of the book is Hiding in the Spotlight, and we're here with the author Greg Dawson, who's written this incredible story of his mom's history. We'll have to come back someday and tell us about the screenplay. Will be the next show we share together. Yeah, when we can watch it together on Netflix or something.
Michael, thank you. This has been so great talking with you, and even before going on the air here, just to link up with a fellow expat Hoosier.
Yeah.
And trade all sorts of stories we won't bore the audience with, but it's been really a treat for me.
Well, we'll try to, because I know you've spoken here at the library too, so maybe the library will have you back at some point too to talk about this. I think you had mentioned that you had done a presentation here with your daughter and your wife and your mom.
Yeah,
actually.
Yes, we did.
Yeah,
that was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
that was a lot of fun, and those particularly when all of us were involved were particularly fun because. There was great interplay between my mother and her granddaughter Amy.
Oh, that must have been just
It was very special, very special. And
well, thanks again, Greg. And,
thank you, Michael, for great conversation.
Well, come back again, and we'll see you next time on Books and Beyond podcast.
Thank you.
Adios. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Books and Beyond from the Winter Park Library. This podcast would not be possible without the generous help and support from the library staff, and especially from Jeremy Zorn. Jeremy's official title is Public Services Librarian, but he does many things here at the library, including producing this podcast. We can't do this without you, Jeremy. Our theme music is from the song Don't Go by Bovine Joe and the Buffalo Herd. That's Herd spelled H-E-A-R-D. We hope you'll let your friends and others know about this podcast and that you'll come by the library for one of our offerings, which you can find at winterparklibrary.org/events. That's winterparklibrary.org/events. If you have questions or suggestions for the podcast or just want to talk about Books and Beyond, please send an email to podcast@winterparklibrary.org. That's an email to podcast@winterparklibrary.org. Remember that the Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. This is Michael Werner, wishing you well until our next episode of Books and Beyond.